There's something about long drives at night, the hum of the highway, the way the world slips past unnoticed. So join us on tonight's relaxing ride as we listen to the story of Alexander the Great, not the whole history, just the part worth remembering, the part that came before he was great, before the battles, before the legends, when he was just a boy, wandering the palace halls of Macedonia, asking questions no one could answer. So before we begin, dim the lights, lay back, and relax. If you enjoy our stories, especially ones told on quiet roads like this, leave a like and let me know in the comments. What time is it where you are? The story begins in Pella, a modest city by ancient standards, but in the 4th century BCE, it was the beating heart of Macedonia. Palaces with open courtyards, columns weathered by salt and sun, and behind the palace walls, a boy was born. Not just any boy. His name was Alexander. His father, King Philip II, was a warrior, ambitious, clever, and endlessly ruthless. His mother, Olympias, well, she was something else entirely. She spoke in dreams, slept beside snakes, and told her son that he was no mere mortal, but descended from Achilles himself. The world around Alexander shimmered with legend, and from the moment he could walk, it was clear he wasn't like the others. While other boys played in the gardens, Alexander would sneak into the stables, searching for a horse that no one could tame. Or he'd sit alone in the library, tracing the faded names of heroes from centuries past. Heracles, Achilles, Perseus. They weren't just stories to him. They were blood. And though he was small, pale even, with piercing eyes and a stubborn jaw, the older soldiers already whispered, "He's watching everything." Alexander didn't smile much, but when he did, it was quiet, like he knew something no one else did. At night, while the rest of the palace slept, he'd sit by his mother and listen to her speak of gods and stars, of fate and fire. "One day," she told him, "you'll go farther than your father ever dreamed." He didn't ask how. He only nodded. Even then, the boy from Pella had already started believing. Alexander was not raised as a boy, but as a legacy. At the age of 7, he left the nursery behind and entered a world of tutors and trials. His father, King Philip, had no time for weakness. He was taught by stern men in stone rooms. Music, rhetoric, mathematics, war. But everything changed when a man named Aristotle arrived. Not yet the bearded statue we remember. Aristotle was sharp, brilliant, and full of ambition. He saw in Alexander not a student, but a vessel, a chance to mold a mind that would one day command the world. They met under a grove of trees in Mieza, far from court politics. There, the boy learned more than science. He learned stories. Homer, Achilles, Heracles. And slowly, he began to see himself among them. Not just a future king, but a myth in the making. Aristotle fed the fire. He spoke of Persian decadence, of philosophy, of logic and ethics. but always with a whisper of conquest behind it. Alexander absorbed it all like dry earth in rain. By 13, he was fluent in strategy, obsessed with glory, and already dreaming of empire. He was not molded like other boys. He was forged. In the palace halls of Pella, two shadows shaped the boy who would become legend. His father, Philip, king, warrior, statesman. Ruthless in battle, sharp in mind, obsessed with empire. He saw in Alexander a vessel for legacy and perhaps competition. But it was Olympias, proud and foreign, who filled her son's ears with destiny. She whispered of gods, of serpents, of bloodlines divine. She told him he was not like other boys. He believed her. They clashed often, Philip and Olympias, over loyalty, ambition, and their son. Caught in the middle, Alexander watched and learned. Then came Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the age, summoned by Philip to shape a mind that would soon command armies. They met beneath the shade of trees in Mieza. There, Alexander was taught not just rhetoric and reason, but how to rule. He read Homer like scripture. He learned to question, to see the world not as it was, but as it could be. And through it all, one idea burned brighter than any. Glory is fleeting, but greatness, that can last forever. It was in his teens that Alexander began to show the kind of brilliance that couldn't be taught, only revealed. The boy who once chased lightning across the hills of Mieza was now immersed in something far more demanding: warfare, politics, and power. Philip had returned from campaigns bloodied but triumphant, now ruling over a vastly stronger Macedon. But it wasn't just Philip's sword that had carved out an empire. It was his mind. And he saw something of that ruthless intelligence reflected in his son. At just 16 years old, Alexander was left as regent, temporary ruler of Macedon, while Philip campaigned elsewhere. It was a ceremonial title, meant to keep the peace. But when a Thracian tribe revolted in the north, Alexander didn't wait for permission. He marched north with a small force and crushed the rebellion. He didn't stop there. He founded a city on the spot, naming it Alexandropolis, and left behind a message. Macedon doesn't wait, and neither does its prince. When Philip returned, he found not a boy in his place, but a conqueror. That same year, Alexander also led troops at the Battle of Chaeronea, a decisive clash against the city-states of Athens and Thebes. He commanded the left wing, opposite his father. The terrain was rough, the enemy fierce. But when the timing was right, Alexander charged headlong into the sacred band of Thebes, an elite, almost mythic force. His attack shattered their line. It was the kind of maneuver generals twice his age would hesitate to attempt. But Alexander didn't hesitate, and that would become a theme. His courage was often mistaken for recklessness, but in truth, it was something else: clarity. Alexander had an uncanny sense of when the moment struck, and when to strike back. Philip noticed. So did the army, and so did the world beyond. But beneath the glory was tension. Father and son, once bonded by shared victories, now cast longer shadows upon each other. Philip remarried to a noble Macedonian woman, and soon a new heir was born. The message was subtle but clear. Alexander was not irreplaceable. At the wedding banquet, tempers flared. One of Philip's generals insulted Alexander's mother, Olympias. Alexander hurled a cup at the man, and when Philip tried to intervene, drunkenly stumbling with a sword in hand, Alexander said, "Here is the man who would cross from Europe into Asia, and yet he cannot cross from one couch to another." The room fell silent. Alexander left court soon after. Olympias fled as well. The rift had become visible. Macedonia had 2 lions and only 1 crown. But fate doesn't pause for family drama. In the shadows of court politics, in the halls of strategy and suspicion, Alexander waited, sharpened like a blade on the whetstone of ambition, because destiny was moving, and soon the boy who chased storms would ride one. Alexander's army moved like a shadow across Anatolia, swift and deliberate. Word of their earlier victories had already raced ahead of them, stirring both awe and defiance among Persian strongholds. One of the greatest of these was Halicarnassus, a coastal fortress city, famed for its massive defensive walls, labyrinthine streets, and loyalty to the Persian cause. The siege would test Alexander in ways he hadn't yet faced. It was one thing to command open field battles. It was another to dismantle an entire city from behind stone walls. The defenders were seasoned, Greek mercenaries led by Memnon of Rhodes, a brilliant strategist with deep loyalty to Darius. He knew every alley of the city, every weak point and angle. He was ready for Alexander, and more importantly, he knew how to delay him. The city gates were sealed shut. Alexander set up siege engines. Great wooden towers were rolled forward, manned with archers and catapults. But the terrain was unforgiving, the walls high and curved, and Memnon fought back with fire. Literally, fire. One night, the defenders launched a daring sortie, burning Alexander's towers and battering rams while his men slept. Flaming pitch lit the darkness, turning siege machines into roaring skeletons of wood. It was a bitter moment for the young king. He had been outplayed, but he adapted. Alexander rotated his men, feigned retreat, then struck at the weakest section of the wall. He forced his way into the outer defenses, street by street, brick by brick. His forces carved a path forward. Civilians fled, the city groaned under the pressure, and eventually, Memnon ordered the city burned rather than handed over whole. It was scorched earth. But it didn't matter. Alexander claimed it anyway. Though the city lay in ashes, the message was clear. Persia's walls would not stop him. No fortress would stand long. Alexander's conquest was no longer just a campaign. It was becoming a force of nature. And in the smoke of Halicarnassus, a new reputation began to take root. Not just as a tactician, but as a relentless storm. One that no wall, no general, and no empire could ignore. The year was 335 BCE. Alexander was just 21, and already the young king stood on the edge of a rebellion. Word had reached him that the city of Thebes, proud, ancient, and fiercely independent, had revolted. They believed Alexander was dead. Rumors had spread that the young Macedonian had perished in battle, and the city moved swiftly, expelling the Macedonian garrison and calling others to rise up. It was a fatal mistake. Alexander didn't hesitate. He marched his army 300 miles in 2 weeks, a feat so swift and unexpected that when he arrived, Thebes was still preparing for war, never expecting him to show up at their gates so soon. He offered them peace. They refused. The siege that followed was brutal. For days, his forces battered the walls, and when they finally breached them, the city fell to fear and sword. More than 6,000 Thebans were killed. The city itself was leveled. Every house, every temple, destroyed. Only the home of the poet Pindar was spared. Alexander had made his message clear. He was not his father, and he would not tolerate rebellion. From that moment on, all of Greece fell silent. No city dared rise against him again. The boy who once studied poetry in the gardens of Pella had now burned a city to the ground. By the autumn of 331 BC, Alexander's campaign had reached a turning point. The decisive battle at Gaugamela, fought under a pale desert sun, marked the collapse of Persian resistance. Though outnumbered nearly 5-1, Alexander's forces shattered Darius's army with precision and fury. Macedonian phalanxes drove forward like a tidal wave. The companion cavalry, with Alexander at its head, punched a hole through the Persian lines. So clean and violent it became legend. Darius fled the battlefield once more, but this time the Persian Empire fell with him. In the wake of victory, Alexander did not rest. He marched into Babylon, where the ancient city welcomed him with open gates. Priests offered incense, nobles offered fealty. Alexander stood in Nebuchadnezzar's ruined halls and proclaimed himself king of Asia. But he wanted more than titles. He wanted legitimacy. He began wearing Persian robes, adopting Persian customs, and even appointing Persian governors to high positions. To his Macedonian men, this was sacrilege, an abandonment of Greek identity. Tension festered like a wound. Some whispered that their king had gone native. Others feared something worse, that Alexander no longer saw himself as a mere man. In Susa, he discovered Darius's treasure, thousands of talents in gold, stored behind colossal gates. With it, he paid his army handsomely, but also began funding something new: monuments, temples, and cities, each bearing his name. It was more than conquest now. It was the birth of an empire built in his image. The moon hung low over the Mesopotamian plain, casting faint silver light over a dust-choked landscape. Beneath that pale glow, the greatest military gamble of Alexander's life was about to unfold. It was October the 1st, 331 BCE, the eve of the Battle of Gaugamela. Darius III, King of Kings, had chosen his ground well. His army outnumbered Alexander's several times over. Estimates suggest over 200,000 Persians faced just 40,000 Macedonians. The terrain had been cleared and flattened to allow chariots and cavalry to maneuver freely. Persian scythed chariots, war elephants, and a sprawling multi-ethnic force awaited their king's command. But Alexander was not afraid. On the eve of battle, he offered a sacrifice to the gods and spoke calmly to his generals. His confidence was unsettling. Not arrogance, but a kind of serene certainty. He believed that the gods were with him, that destiny, not numbers, would decide tomorrow. As dawn broke, the two armies arranged themselves on opposite ends of the plain. Dust swirled. Shields gleamed in the sun. Drums beat like distant thunder. Alexander's plan was simple and devastating. He didn't strike at the center. Instead, he angled his elite companion cavalry to the right, drawing the Persian left wing out of formation. As the Persians pursued, gaps opened in their line. That was the moment he had waited for. In one rapid maneuver, Alexander wheeled his cavalry back inward, a hammer striking through the exposed heart of the Persian line. His phalanxes pushed forward. The Persian center crumbled. Darius, seeing his lines falter and chaos spreading, fled the field in his chariot. Again, the once invincible Persian army broke. What had begun as a test of strength ended in total collapse. Gaugamela wasn't just a victory, it was an end. The end of Persia's centuries-old dominance. The end of Darius's credibility as king. And the moment the known world shifted its axis. After the battle, Alexander marched into Babylon unopposed. He was no longer simply a conqueror. He was becoming something more. A successor to Cyrus and Xerxes, a ruler of Emerus, a living bridge between East and West. But even in victory, questions lingered. Darius still lived, retreating eastward to gather allies. The empire was not yet fully his. And deeper still, something had begun to change in Alexander himself. A flicker of restlessness, of ambition, darkening into obsession. Gaugamela had made him unstoppable. Now the world would see what that meant. Tyre had stood for centuries as the jewel of the Phoenician coast, a fortress city perched on a rocky island, half a mile offshore, its walls rising straight out of the sea. No army had ever breached it. Alexander meant to change that. He had already taken Sidon. Now, Tyre blocked his path to controlling the eastern Mediterranean. The city refused to allow him entry, even to make a simple offering at their temple of Heracles. That insult sealed their fate. Alexander didn't send emissaries. He sent engineers. His order was simple. Build a road through the sea. They called it a causeway, but it was more than that. It was an act of defiance against geography itself. Day by day, under the blazing sun and constant assault from Tyrian archers and fire ships, Alexander's men dragged stone, rubble, and timber into the water. Progress was slow. The water was deep, the seabed uneven, and Tyre's defenders relentless. Tyre mocked them. Their ships rained fire down on the causeway. Divers swam beneath to sabotage the structure. Every inch of progress was paid for in blood and sweat. Morale faltered, but Alexander's will never cracked. He ordered siege towers, monstrous, rolling fortresses built atop the causeway. Ships were brought in from nearby ports to form a blockade. Slowly, painfully, the Macedonians advanced across the sea. It took 7 months. Finally, in July of 332 BC, the walls of Tyre were breached. What followed was a slaughter. Alexander's men poured into the city through the broken walls, fighting in narrow streets, slick with seawater and blood. The Tyrians resisted with everything they had, but they were outmatched. Brutality met brutality. Fires spread. Families were dragged into captivity. Bodies piled in alleyways. Over 6,000 defenders were killed. Another 30,000 were enslaved. Alexander himself led from the front, sword in hand, cutting a path through the rubble and smoke. When the battle was done, he refused to rest. Instead, he walked the length of the causeway, now a permanent bridge to a ruined island, and stood before the temple they once denied him. No more defiance, no more refusal. Tyre had fallen, not just in body, but in spirit, and with it, the last true barrier to Alexander's domination of the East. After the fall of Tyre, Alexander did not pause. He barely allowed his army to rest before turning inland, through the deserts of Syria and the mountains of Mesopotamia. Word had reached him that Darius III, king of Persia, was gathering a massive force, far larger than any he had faced before. Alexander had already defeated Darius once, at Issus. But the Persian king had escaped. Now, Darius wanted revenge. He was preparing for a final, decisive battle, one that would crush the Macedonian threat forever. The two armies would meet near the village of Gaugamela. Alexander's scouts brought back chilling reports. The Persian army numbered over 200,000 men. They had chariots with scythed wheels, war elephants, and fresh battalions from across the empire. The battlefield had been leveled and cleared to give the chariots full advantage. Alexander had only 47,000 men, but he had something Darius didn't: experience, discipline, and momentum. On the night before the battle, Alexander slept soundly under the open sky. His generals were anxious, pacing, but when they asked him why he rested so calmly, he answered, "Because we have already won." At dawn, the Macedonians advanced in silence. The Persians, stretched across the plains in a shimmering line, waited for them. Trumpets sounded. The chariots surged forward. Alexander had anticipated this. At the last moment, he gave the order, and his troops opened corridors in their formation, letting the deadly chariots pass harmlessly through. Behind them, hidden units waited. They swarmed the chariots from the rear. Then Alexander himself led a cavalry charge straight into the heart of the Persian line, aiming directly for Darius. Panic spread like fire. The Persian king lost his nerve. Just as he had at Issus, Darius turned and fled the field. With their leader gone, the Persian army collapsed. Thousands were cut down. Thousands more surrendered. The great empire that had stood for centuries now lay broken. Alexander had done what no Greek had ever done. He had shattered the power of Persia, and the road to Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis lay wide open before him. He did not celebrate. That night, as his men sang around the fires and counted their plunder, Alexander stood alone on a ridge, staring east. Somewhere beyond those dark hills was the rest of the world, unknown, unconquered, and he would not stop until it bowed before him. Alexander stood at the gates of Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire. The city shimmered like a jewel, gold, marble, towering columns. But beneath the surface, it was a symbol of everything he had fought against: decadence, defiance, and the old world that refused to yield. He marched his army into the city, unopposed. The great king was dead. The Persian Empire, once mighty, had fractured. And now, Alexander, the boy from Macedon, stood alone at its center. Some say he wept that day, not from sorrow, but from the weight of it all. He had conquered the unconquerable. There was no one left to defeat, no battlefield left to win. But still he moved forward. He pushed eastward into unknown lands, through deserts and mountains, past the edge of every known map. In Bactria and Sogdiana, he faced guerrilla war and betrayal. He took a wife, Roxana, a local noble's daughter, in an attempt to unite the cultures he'd conquered. Not all his men approved. By the time he crossed into India, his army was weary. But Alexander saw only one direction: forward. In 326 BC, he reached the banks of the Hydaspes River. There, he faced King Porus, a ruler with war elephants and tens of thousands of soldiers. The battle was brutal. Horses panicked. Men were trampled. But Alexander outmaneuvered them, crossing the river under cover of a storm and flanking Porus at dawn. Porus was defeated, but impressed Alexander. When asked how he wished to be treated, he replied, "Like a king." And Alexander, amused and enforced, let him keep his lands under Macedonian rule. But the victory came at a cost. Alexander's men had had enough. They refused to march further east. They'd reached the edge of the known world, and they wanted to go home. Alexander relented, reluctantly. The return journey through the Gedrosian desert was a disaster. Thousands died of thirst and heat. Alexander nearly perished himself. By the time they reached Babylon, the army was a shadow of what it had once been. And yet, he still dreamed of new cities, of blending east and west, of a world under one rule. But time was catching up with him. He was just 32 years old. By 324 BC, the known world lay beneath Alexander's feet. From Greece to Egypt, across Babylon, and deep into the heart of Persia. His empire stretched farther than any had imagined. He was no longer a general or a king. He was a legend living in real time. A man said to be descended from gods, undefeated in battle, worshipped in temples, feared by kings. But not even legends can escape time. After years of war, his body began to fray. His closest companions had died, one by one. Some in battle, others by execution, ordered by Alexander himself. His paranoia had grown with every conquest. The weight of empire pressed down, and he no longer slept easily. He drank more, trusted less, and yet he dreamed bigger than ever. In Babylon, he began planning a campaign to conquer Arabia and then Carthage, to sail west to the edge of the world. He spoke of building a new capital, a city that would outshine even Alexandria, a city at the center of everything. But none of it would happen. In June of 323 BC, Alexander fell ill after a banquet. At first, his generals assumed it was the wine or the heat, but day after day, he worsened. Fever, pain, weakness. Soon, he could no longer speak. As he lay dying, the question that haunted every man in the room hung heavy in the air. Who would rule the greatest empire the world had ever seen? When asked, Alexander is said to have whispered only 3 words: "To the strongest." With that, he was gone. He was just 32 years old. His body was placed in a golden sarcophagus and paraded through Egypt. Wars broke out almost immediately, his generals fighting not for his dream, but for power. The empire shattered, but the myth endured, because Alexander had done the impossible. He had walked into the heart of the world and made it kneel. He had conquered more land than any man before him. And though his empire didn't last, the stories did. Every king after would chase what Alexander built. But none would ever match it. Not quite. We hope this quiet drive through the past brought you somewhere unexpected, somewhere darker, deeper, and just a little more mysterious than you thought you'd go tonight. If it stayed with you, even just a little, tap like, subscribe for the next ride, and tell us which story should unfold next. Until then, thanks for watching, and good night.